scream in the forest. I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural, you know? Always figured there was a logical explanation for everything. But what happened a few weeks ago while driving down a deserted road in North Carolina completely flipped my perspective. Even now, I wonder if I made the right decision that night. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town. The road I took was one of those isolated highways, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. There wasn't another car in sight, and the only light came from my headlights slicing through the darkness. Perfect setup for one of those horror stories you only see in movies, right? I was focused on the road, barely paying attention to the low music playing on the radio when suddenly, I heard it, a scream. A woman's scream, distant but desperate, cutting through the night. My heart skipped a beat. I turned off the radio, straining to hear where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the forest to my left, but the thick darkness and the echo made it feel like it was coming from everywhere at once. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel. My mind raced with all the stories I'd heard about traps and ambushes. But what if it wasn't a trick? What if someone was really in trouble out there? Against my better judgment, I pulled over to the shoulder, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but then the scream echoed again, weaker this time, but just as desperate. It sent a chill down my spine, but something, maybe instinct, pushed me to get out of the car. With my phone's flashlight in hand, I stepped into the forest. The darkness swallowed me whole, and each step felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The screams never seemed to get closer. No matter how far I walked, they stayed the same distance away, like they were taunting me. The farther I went, the more uneasy I became. The trees around me felt like they were closing in, watching me, and suddenly, the scream that once seemed so human started to sound. Off, distorted, almost inhuman. Panic kicked in, and I turned around, bolting back toward the car. Every snapped twig under my feet felt like a gunshot in the silence, and all I could think about was getting back to the safety of my car. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the car, relief washed over me, but only for a moment. The screams had stopped. I froze, listening to the oppressive silence, then quickly climbed into the car, hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I peeled out of there, the drive home a blur. All I could think about was what might have happened if I had kept following those screams. 3 days later, I saw the news. They had found a body in that same forest, not far from where I had been that night. It was a woman, brutally murdered. The thought that I might have heard her in her final moments haunts me to this day. What disturbs me most is the possibility that the woman was trying to warn me or was desperately asking for help one last time. All I know is that on that night, terror became real for me. The Cursed Doll. My name is Hannah, and I've always had a fascination with old things. I love visiting flea markets, antique fairs, and thrift shops, hunting for unique pieces. I never imagined that this harmless hobby would lead me into such a terrifying situation. It all started on a spring Saturday when I went to a garage sale in an old neighborhood of the city. The house was large, with a yard full of old furniture, dusty books, and knickknacks. As I rummaged through a table filled with porcelain objects, my eyes fell on an antique doll, placed off to the side in a rocking chair. The doll was beautiful in a dark way. She had long curly blonde hair, glass blue eyes that seemed to look right at me, and a white lace dress that had yellowed with age. There was something unsettling about her, but I couldn't look away. I decided to buy her, thinking she would make an interesting addition to my collection. When I got home, I placed the doll on a shelf in the living room, among other old objects I had accumulated over the years. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, but soon I realized that the atmosphere in the house seemed to have changed. There was a heavy feeling in the air, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. The first night after bringing the doll home was the hardest. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched. It was such an intense sensation that I couldn't go back to sleep. I looked around the room, but there was nothing there, just darkness and silence. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe the result of watching too many horror movies. But then things started to get worse. During the day, I would hear small noises coming from the living room, like something was moving. Sometimes it was the sound of wood creaking, other times, it was a soft noise, almost like someone whispering. When I went to check, everything was in place, but the doll always seemed to be in a slightly different position from how I remembered. One morning, I noticed that the objects around the doll on the shelf had been moved. I thought maybe I had done it without realizing it, but something didn't feel right. I decided to test it. That night, I placed the doll back on the shelf, facing the room, and took a picture with my phone. When I woke up the next morning, I took another photo to compare. The result gave me chills. The doll was turned, facing the wall, even though I was sure I had left her facing forward. No one else was in the house, so how could this have happened? I started to get really scared. The nightmares began soon after. I dreamed of the doll every night, always the same scene. In the dream, I was paralyzed, lying in bed, and the doll would move slowly through the house, her cold eyes fixed on me. She would reach the foot of the bed, climb up slowly, and stop right next to my face. Then her porcelain lips would start to move, but no sound would come out. I would always wake up in a cold sweat, and each morning, the doll was in a different position. I decided I needed to get rid of her, but something inside me held me back. It was as if the doll had some kind of control over me, an influence I couldn't explain. Finally, one morning, after another night of nightmares, I mustered the courage to throw the doll in the trash. I felt immediate relief, but at the same time, a strange sense of loss. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. But when I woke up, the relief was gone. The doll was back, sitting on the shelf, exactly where I had placed her the first time. My heart raced, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I called a friend who believed in paranormal things and asked for help. She brought a medium, who, upon entering the house, turned pale. He said the doll was infused with a very negative, possibly even malevolent, energy. He suggested we burn it and perform a cleansing ritual in the house. That's what we did. We took the doll to a remote location, built a bonfire, and threw her into the flames. As the doll burned, a high-pitched, almost human scream echoed through the air, as if something was being released. We stood there, horrified, until the flames consumed everything. After that, the house returned to normal. The heavy feeling in the air disappeared, and the nightmares finally stopped. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I made a mistake by bringing that doll into my home. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel like I'm still being watched, as if something that was in the doll never really left. The shadow in the attic. My husband, Dan, and I always dreamed of owning an old house with character. When we found a century-old Victorian in a small Massachusetts town, we couldn't resist. The house was beautiful, with tall windows, a wraparound porch, and, of course, a spacious attic that Dan wanted to turn into an office. From the beginning, though, something felt off about the attic. The rest of the house was cozy, full of light, but the attic, it was different. It was always cold, even on warm days, and no matter how much sunlight streamed through the windows, it never seemed to reach the corners. But Dan was excited about transforming it, so we started clearing it out. In the farthest corner of the attic, we found an old wooden box, covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside was a diary and some black and white photos of a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, with long curly hair. The diary, though old and worn, was legible. It belonged to a girl named Abigail, who had lived in the house long ago. As we read, Abigail's story unfolded. She was an only child who spent a lot of time alone in the attic, creating an imaginary world for herself. But soon, her entries took a darker turn. She wrote about a friend she called the Shadow, a presence that lived with her in the attic. At first, it seemed like a product of a lonely child's imagination, but the tone of her writing grew more desperate. Abigail wrote that the shadow moved things around in the attic, whispered to her at night, and even came closer while she slept. In one of the last entries, she wrote, "The shadow wants me to stay with her forever." That gave us both chills. Dan and I tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just a child's fantasy. But after finding the diary, strange things started happening. We'd hear noises coming from the attic, soft footsteps, the creak of the floorboards. Every time Dan checked, he found nothing, but the air up there seemed heavier, almost suffocating. One night, while we were watching TV, the lights started flickering. Dan went to the basement to check the circuit breaker, but everything was fine. Then we heard a loud crash upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the attic. Dan grabbed a flashlight, and I followed him up the stairs, my heart pounding. The attic door was open, even though we had closed it earlier. Inside, the air was freezing, and the flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness. As Dan scanned the room, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, moving quickly across the wall. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But then it moved again, this time stopping in front of us, forming an indistinct shape. Dan saw it too, and we both stood there, paralyzed. The shadow seemed to pulse, and suddenly, I felt an icy coldness grip my spine. A faint whisper filled the air, but I couldn't make out the words. Panic surged through me, and we both bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind us. Neither of us slept that night. The house felt different, like something was watching us. The next day, we called a paranormal expert. He spent hours in the house, and when he finished, he looked shaken. He said the attic held a heavy energy, a presence that might be Abigail and her shadow friend, trapped somehow. He recommended a cleansing, but warned that the energy might be too strong to remove completely. After the cleansing, things calmed down, but the unease never fully went away. Eventually, we decided to move. The house was still beautiful, but the attic, that cold, dark attic, left a mark on us both. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Abigail, the girl who spent her days alone up there. I wonder if she ever found peace, or if the shadow still holds her captive, waiting for another lonely soul to join her. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. Ouija in the abandoned church. I never used to believe in spirits or hauntings, but the night my friends and I decided to visit the abandoned St. Mary's Church in Indiana completely changed my view of what's real and what's imaginary. Even now, just thinking about what happened sends a shiver down my spine. Maybe we should have never gone there, but curiosity and the search for a different experience got the better of us. It all started as a silly idea. We were bored on a Friday night with nothing to do when Sarah suggested we try out the Ouija board she had found at her grandmother's house. It was one of those old ones, made of dark wood with gold letters faded by time. At that moment, it seemed like a harmless game, something we'd laugh about later. But things quickly spiraled out of control. We decided the perfect place for our session would be the old St. Mary's Church, which had been abandoned for over 20 years. No one knew exactly why the church had been left to rot, but there were rumors that something dark had happened there. The older folks in town said the priest who ran the church had mysteriously disappeared, and after that, strange things started happening at the site. Of course, we thought it was just gossip, but the idea of a spooky place only added to our excitement. We arrived at the church around 11 p.m. Darkness had already taken over the place, and the few lights from our flashlights only heightened the tension. The silence there was almost tangible, as if time had stopped since the last worshiper left the church. We entered through the main door, which creaked in a way that made our hearts skip a beat, but we kept moving forward, nervously laughing to mask our growing fear. Inside the church, the air was thick, filled with dust and something else we couldn't quite identify. The wooden floor creaked under our feet, and the walls were still decorated with faded fresco fragments, worn away by time. On the altar, there was still a crucifix, tilted at a strange angle, as if it were about to fall. Sarah placed the Ouija board on the floor, right in the center of the main hall, and we all sat around it in a circle. I clearly remember the cold I felt when I put my hands on the planchette. We were all there, silent, waiting for something to happen, but not really believing it would. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice softly echoing off the empty walls. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment, nothing happened, and we started to relax, thinking the experience would end up being just a silly story to tell later. That's when the planchette moved. Slowly, but steadily, it began to slide across the board, forming the word yes. We all looked at each other, trying to hide our nervousness, but it was clear something was happening. We continued asking questions, and the answers got stranger and stranger, as if a presence there was toying with us, provoking us. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the back of the church. Something broke the silence with a loud crash, making us jump. It sounded like a heavy object falling or maybe a door slamming shut. The tension in the air intensified, and we started feeling like we were being watched. We tried to ignore it and continue the session, but soon it became clear we weren't welcome there. That's when things really went out of control. Objects that had been still, like candles and pieces of wood, started flying across the room. A cold wind, which shouldn't have existed inside that sealed church, swept through the hall, and the feeling of imminent danger overwhelmed us. Each of us wanted to leave, but it felt like we were trapped, as if something was holding us back, preventing us from escaping. Finally, someone screamed, I think it was Emily, and that broke the trance. We bolted for the door, leaving the Ouija board behind, driven by the fear of getting out of that cursed place as fast as we could. The darkness outside seemed almost comforting compared to what we had left behind, but the feeling that something was following us didn't leave until we reached our cars and sped away. The next day, still shaken, we decided to return to the church to retrieve the Ouija board. None of us wanted that cursed object to stay there or, worse, fall into someone else's hands. But when we arrived, the board was gone. We searched every corner, knowing no one else had entered the church since we left, but it had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. To this day, we don't know what really happened that night. Whether we awakened some supernatural force or our own minds played tricks on us, the experience left scars on all of us. We never talked about it again, but the terror of that night, when the unexplainable mingled with the ordinary, still lives in our memories, reminding us that some things were never meant to be understood. Night in jail. I've always been the kind of guy who avoids trouble, who prefers to handle things calmly. But that night, in a nightclub in downtown Chicago, something went completely out of control. I had gone there to celebrate a friend's birthday, and everything was going well until, at the end of the night, I got into an argument with one of the bouncers. The guy was big, intimidating, and probably used to dealing with troublesome drunks. But I wasn't drunk, and I didn't even try to start a fight. Things just escalated too quickly. It all started because I was trying to leave the club, and he pushed me, saying I needed to wait my turn. It was a misunderstanding, but I reacted poorly to the push, and we ended up arguing. Within minutes, the situation got out of hand, and before I knew it, 2 other bouncers had pinned me down and dragged me outside. I tried to explain that I hadn't done anything, but no one seemed interested in listening. That's when the police showed up. The officers didn't pay much attention to my side of the story. Maybe because the bouncers convinced them I was the problem, or maybe because it was easier just to arrest me than to sort it out right there. I was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, still in disbelief about what was happening. I had never been arrested before, and the idea of spending the night in jail filled me with dread. When I got to the station, I was put in a cell with another man. He seemed way too calm, like he was used to the situation. For the first few minutes, I stayed silent, trying to make sense of how this had happened to me. But eventually, we started talking. He introduced himself as Ray, said he was there because of a bar fight. He seemed like a normal guy, the kind you'd meet on any street corner. During the conversation, I ended up sharing more than I should have. I told him about my life, my job as a financial analyst, and even mentioned that I lived alone in an apartment in Lincoln Park, a quiet area of Chicago. At the time, I didn't realize how that information could be used against me. I was just trying to pass the time, dealing with the anxiety of being in jail for something I knew I hadn't done. The night passed slowly, and I barely got any sleep. The next day, I was released without much explanation. It seemed they realized the whole thing had been a mistake. Relieved to be out of there, I went home and tried to forget what had happened. But the feeling of injustice wouldn't leave me, and the memory of that man in the cell, Ray, kept nagging at me in a way I couldn't explain. A few days later, on an ordinary night, I was at home watching TV when I heard a strange noise coming from the front door. My first thought was that it was a neighbor, but the noise repeated, and this time it sounded like someone was trying to force the lock. My heart started racing, and I ran to grab the phone and call the police. As I did, I heard the sound of glass breaking in the living room. I tried to stay calm as I explained the situation to the 911 operator. They instructed me to lock myself in a room and wait, which I did immediately. The idea of someone inside my house terrified me. I stayed completely silent, trying to hear what was happening outside. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and I knew I was in serious danger. Finally, I heard the police sirens approaching, and the footsteps in my house stopped. I waited, heart in my throat, until I heard the officers entering, shouting for the intruder to surrender. They searched the house, and a few minutes later, they knocked on the door of the room where I was hiding, telling me it was safe to come out. When I stepped out, still trembling, they showed me the intruder, Ray, the man I had shared a cell with just days before. That's when everything clicked. Ray had used the information I had shared in the cell to find me and try to rob my house. The panic I felt when I realized this was indescribable. I had trusted someone out of pure need for company in a vulnerable moment, and that trust had almost cost me dearly. Since then, I can't relax at home like I used to. The idea that someone could use something as simple as a conversation to plan something so sinister haunts me. And every time I think about it, I feel a chill down my spine, as if the terror of that night is still there, lurking, ready to strike again. The Hermit in the Forest. My name is Sam, and I've always loved camping. There's something about the solitude of the woods, the disconnection from the modern world, that has always drawn me in. But a trip I took with some friends last summer changed my perspective forever. Now, I can't think about camping without feeling a shiver down my spine. We were in a national park in northern Michigan, a dense, rarely explored area. We planned to spend the weekend camping, fishing, and exploring trails that rarely saw human presence. On the first night, we set up camp near a lake, a peaceful spot surrounded by tall trees swaying gently in the breeze. Everything seemed perfect until, on the second day, while exploring a trail, we came across something unexpected. The trail started to close in with increasingly dense vegetation, and we were about to turn back when we saw a small cabin among the trees. It was a rustic structure made of logs and branches, with a roof covered in moss. The cabin looked old, almost abandoned, but there was a trail of smoke coming from its chimney. My friends and I exchanged curious looks. Who would live out here, so isolated from everything? We decided to approach for a closer look, maybe even chat with whoever was there. After all, meeting new people and sharing stories around the campfire is part of the camping spirit. As we got closer to the cabin, we noticed that the place looked even stranger up close. There were wooden totems crudely carved around the entrance, with faces that seemed to scream silently. The air around was heavy, almost oppressive, and a sweet but nauseating smell filled the atmosphere. Before we could knock on the door, it slowly opened, revealing an old man with a long, tangled beard and eyes that shone unusually bright in the shadows. He observed us for a moment before speaking in a hoarse voice, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "Lost?" he asked, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. We, a bit unsettled, explained that we were camping nearby and had stumbled upon his cabin by accident. The old man invited us in, saying it would be good for him to have company. Reluctantly, we entered, still trying to process the strange atmosphere around us. The inside of the cabin was dark, lit only by the crackling fire in the fireplace. The walls were covered in animal pelts and old objects that seemed ritualistic, bones hanging, feathered talismans, and dried herbs in small bags. The man, who introduced himself as Elias, offered us tea from an old kettle boiling on the fire. Something about it deeply disturbed me, but my friend seemed relaxed, accepting the tea and starting to chat with Elias about life in the woods. I sat near the window, watching the dusk approach and trying to ignore the feeling that we were making a mistake. Elias began to tell stories about the forest, ancient tales of spirits that inhabited the trees and beings that walked among the living. He spoke with a conviction that was both fascinating and unsettling. The way he described these beings, creatures that could shapeshift, that fed on the fear of the lost, left me feeling uneasy. Suddenly, the conversation took a darker turn. Elias looked at us with a fixed stare and said, "The forest is no place for the weak of spirit. There are things here that most people never see, but that are always watching. And sometimes, they choose someone to follow." The silence that followed was oppressive. I wanted to leave, but something in me was trapped in the moment, in the mystery of what Elias was insinuating. That's when we heard a strange sound outside, like footsteps, but more dragged, as if something was being pulled across the ground. Elias stood up abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "You'd better go," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Night falls quickly here, and the forest is not safe after dark." We got up quickly, thanking him for his hospitality as we hurried out of the cabin. As we left, I heard Elias mutter something, almost inaudible, but it sounded like a prayer or a warning. As we walked back to camp, the sun had already set, and the forest around us felt much darker, almost threatening. None of us spoke much, but there was tension in the air, a feeling that we were not alone. We reached the camp, but the atmosphere didn't improve. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the sounds of the forest, which had once been relaxing, now felt like a warning. No one wanted to admit it, but we all felt that something was wrong. We decided it was best not to spend the night there. We started to pack up the camp as quickly as possible, ready to leave. However, as I turned to grab one last backpack, I saw something that made me freeze. At the edge of the forest, in the twilight, stood a figure. It was tall, much taller than any human should be, and its form was indistinct, as if it were shrouded in shadows. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes, two bright points, reflecting the little light that was left. They were fixed on us, and even at a distance, I felt an oppressive presence, a weight on my mind telling me to run. We ran. We ran as if our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. When we finally reached the car and locked the doors, no one said a word. We just drove, leaving the forest and the cabin behind, never looking back. Since that day, I haven't gone camping again. The forests that once brought me peace now haunt me. And sometimes, in my nightmares, I still see those bright eyes in the darkness, watching, waiting, as if they know that somewhere in my mind, I'm still trapped in that night. The Dream Room. My name is Julia, and what I'm about to share still makes me question reality. I was never someone who believed in premonitory dreams or the supernatural, but an experience I had a few years ago made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the world around me. It all started with a dream. It was a simple dream, but extremely vivid. I was in a room I had never seen before. The walls were a soft shade of blue, and there was a large, antique rug in the center, with intricate patterns that seemed to dance under my feet. The room had a window overlooking a garden, but what caught my attention the most was the bed. It was a canopy bed, with velvet red curtains that swayed gently as if an invisible breeze were passing through them. In the dream, I felt strangely at peace, like I was home, but at the same time, there was a feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and a sense of unease grew in my chest as I moved around the room. I always woke up before I could figure out what it was. This dream began to repeat. At first, it appeared once a week, then it became more frequent until I was having it every night. And every time I dreamed, the room seemed more familiar, more real, as if I were being drawn into it. I could feel the touch of the velvet curtains, the coldness of the floor beneath my feet, the scent of flowers wafting in from the garden outside. After weeks of having the same dream, I started to get worried. I told a friend, who suggested that I might just be dealing with work stress, but I knew it was more than that. The dream seemed to be trying to show me something I couldn't understand. One day, while walking around town on a Saturday afternoon, I saw a sign for an antique sale at an old mansion that had been converted into an art gallery. Curiosity led me there, and as soon as I entered, I was immediately drawn to one of the rooms in the back. When I walked through the door, my heart nearly stopped. It was the room from my dream. The same blue walls, the same antique rug on the floor, and the canopy bed with the red velvet curtains. I stood there, frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. How could the room from my dreams exist in real life? The gallery owner, an elderly woman with a gentle smile, noticed my state and approached me. "This is the oldest room in the mansion," she said, as if answering an unasked question. "It's been preserved exactly as it was when the house was built over 100 years ago. People say it's a special place, full of stories." I was about to ask more when a chill enveloped me. The room, which had previously felt welcoming, suddenly felt uninviting. The light seemed to dim, and the air grew heavy, just like in the dream. The same unease grew within me, and the feeling that something was wrong intensified. Before I could react, a shadow quickly passed through the room, like a fleeting figure that disappeared before I could focus on it. My body stiffened, and the elderly woman seemed unaware of anything strange. She continued to talk about the room's history, but her words became indistinct, muffled by the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, I felt an urgent need to get out of there. I quickly thanked the woman and hurried out of the mansion. When I finally got home, I was exhausted and confused, trying to process what had just happened. That night, the dream returned, but this time it was different. In the dream, I was back in the room, but now there was someone else there with me. An indistinct figure, a woman, stood near the bed. She slowly turned toward me, and even in my dream, I felt fear grip me. Her eyes were empty, but they conveyed a deep sadness, as if she were trapped there, unable to move on. She whispered something, but I couldn't understand. All I felt was the urgency, the need to escape that place. I woke up suddenly, sweating and with my heart racing. Since that day, the dream stopped, but the feeling of being watched never fully left me. I still think about that room, about that sad and lonely figure, and I wonder if she's still there, waiting for someone who can understand her message, someone who can set her free. I never went back to that mansion, and whenever I pass by, I hurry along, feeling a chill down my spine. Something in that room found me, touched me in a way I'll never be able to forget. And although I escaped, part of me is still trapped there, in the dream room that became a nightmare. The Phantom Hand. My name is Ethan, and I'm the kind of person who always looks for rational explanations for everything. I'm a natural skeptic, and I've always believed that there's a logical reason behind everything, until the day I encountered something that, to this day, I can't explain. It all started when I bought an old house in the suburbs of a small town in Pennsylvania. The house was one of those classic early 20th century constructions, with creaky wooden floors and a dark, damp basement that seemed to have been barely used over the years. Despite the state of the house, I saw potential in it and decided it was the perfect place for me. I spent the first few months renovating the house, mainly on weekends when I had free time. The basement was one of the last places I decided to fix up. It was a spacious but gloomy area, with stone walls and old shelves full of things that seemed to belong to previous owners. One day, I decided it was time to organize the basement. I started moving boxes, cleaning the floor, and sorting through what could be thrown away. I was so focused on the task that I almost didn't notice the temperature suddenly drop. The air became icy, as if I had stepped into a refrigerator. I thought maybe there was something wrong with the heating system, but when I looked around, everything seemed normal. I kept working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I first felt a light pressure on my shoulder. It was a subtle touch, but cold, as if someone had placed a hand there. I immediately turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the basement was empty. I tried to ignore what had happened, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was getting tired and starting to imagine things. But then it happened again. This time, the sensation was more intense, as if an invisible hand was trying to hold me back. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and I stepped back, nearly tripping over a box. I looked around, my heart pounding, but again, there was no one there. The air seemed to grow heavier by the second, and the silence in the basement was so deep it was almost deafening. That's when I realized there was something down there with me, something I couldn't see but was clearly trying to communicate in some way. I decided I had done enough for the day and quickly headed up the stairs, closing the basement door behind me. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to forget what had happened, but the feeling of that hand on my shoulder wouldn't leave my mind. That night, as I tried to sleep, the sensation returned. I felt that cold hand again, but this time it was gripping my ankle. I woke up with a start, feeling a chill run through my body. I looked to the foot of the bed, but all I saw was darkness. However, the feeling of being touched remained, as if the hand was still there, holding me, even though I couldn't see it. In the following days, things only got worse. The presence in the basement seemed to be growing stronger, more insistent. I heard footsteps when I was alone in the house, and doors that should have been closed appeared open without explanation. And always, without fail, that cold, invisible hand would return, sometimes gripping my arm, other times touching my face as I slept. Finally, I decided I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I sought out a paranormal activity specialist, a man with a good reputation in the field. He visited the house, and as soon as he went down to the basement, he immediately felt what I had been experiencing. He said there was a strong presence there, something or someone who was trapped in that place and desperately trying to communicate. The specialist performed a sort of ritual, an attempt to release the presence that had been tormenting me. During the ritual, he mentioned that the spirit seemed to belong to a man who had died in the house many years ago, probably in a tragic accident that left him trapped between the world of the living and the dead. After that night, things calmed down. The presence was gone, and the sensation of invisible hands touching me finally stopped. However, I can't shake the feeling that something from the basement is still with me, a shadow that lingers in the darkest corners of the house. Since then, I avoid going down to the basement, and when I'm home, I always feel like I'm not completely alone. Maybe the specialist freed the spirit, but part of me believes that the presence, or at least its memory, still lingers, waiting for something or someone who can finally give it rest. The mysterious passenger. I'm Jake, and I've been a taxi driver for over 10 years. I've driven all kinds of people in my car, but one ride on a rainy autumn night in New Jersey is something I'll never forget. It was the kind of experience that made me question what really exists beyond what we can see. It was a typical night, the kind where customers are few, especially with the heavy rain that wouldn't stop. I was about to end my shift, already thinking about heading home, when I got a call to pick up a passenger in a remote neighborhood near a road that led to the local cemetery. I hesitated for a moment, but work is work, so I went. I arrived at the given address, an old Victorian house that looked like it had seen better days. I parked out front and waited, but no one came out. The house was completely dark, with no lights on. I looked at the clock, giving it a few more minutes before I left, when I saw a female figure come out of the front door. She was wearing a white dress that almost seemed to glow under the headlights, contrasting with the darkness around her. Her face was partially covered by a veil, but I could see she was a young woman, with long black hair cascading over her shoulders. She walked slowly to the car, and when she got into the back seat, I felt a wave of cold wash over the vehicle. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual despite the strange feeling that had taken hold of me. "To the cemetery, please," she replied, in a soft, almost whispered voice. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't common for someone to ask to go to the cemetery at that hour, especially in a storm like that. But I was used to unusual requests, and despite the uncomfortable feeling, I started driving. As we made our way to the cemetery, the rain seemed to get heavier. The sound of raindrops hitting the car roof was almost deafening. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the woman in the back seat, but the darkness inside the car made it hard to see. All I could make out was her shadow, still, as if lost in thought. The drive to the cemetery wasn't long, but the trip seemed to drag on. The cold in the car intensified, and even with the heater on, I couldn't warm up. Then, in a flash of courage, I decided to try making small talk. "Have you lived here long?" I asked, hoping to dispel the strange atmosphere. She took a while to respond, and when she did, her voice seemed distant. "Yes. A long time." Something about the way she spoke unsettled me. There was a deep sadness in her words, as if she carried a heavy burden. I decided not to push it, and the rest of the ride was silent. Finally, we arrived at the cemetery. I parked the taxi at the entrance, waiting for her to get out, but the woman remained still. I turned to tell her we had arrived, but when I looked at the back seat, it was empty. The spot where she had been was now completely vacant, except for a damp spot on the seat, as if someone wet had been sitting there. My heart started racing. There was no way she could have left without me noticing, and the car door hadn't even opened. I looked around, trying to find some logical explanation, but the cemetery was deserted, covered in the mist of the rain. Terrified, I decided to head home as quickly as possible. When I got there, still in shock, I told the story to my wife, who looked at me with a serious expression. She had grown up in that town and knew a lot about its legends and old stories. She told me that many years ago, a young bride had tragically died on her wedding day in a car accident on the way to the church. They say that since then, her spirit wanders the roads around the cemetery, waiting for someone to take her to her final destination. Since that night, I've never accepted rides near that cemetery again. And sometimes, when I drive down that road, I still feel a cold shiver, as if her presence is still around, waiting for another unsuspecting driver to take her where she never got to go. Terrifying encounter with a customer. Working the night shift at a gas station was never something I imagined doing for long. The hours were long and lonely, and most of the customers were truck drivers or people just passing through. Most nights were quiet, with only a few cars stopping to refuel, and the radio playing softly to break the silence. However, there was one night in particular that completely changed the way I viewed that job. It started like any other night. The clock read around 2 a.m., and I was reorganizing the shelves of snacks and drinks. The sound of the bell above the door caught my attention, and I looked up to see who had come in. It was a regular customer, someone I recognized from his frequent visits. He always came around this time, bought a coffee and maybe a magazine, and then went on his way. But that night, something was different. When he walked in, I immediately noticed that his clothes were completely soaked, as if he had just come out of a river. His hair was dripping, and there was a strange expression on his face, something between fear and exhaustion. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring the shelves, and looked me in the eyes with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "I need to hide," he said, his voice low and urgent. I froze for a moment, not knowing how to respond. This wasn't something I heard every day, and the way he said those words made my heart race. "What happened?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but he just shook his head and repeated, "I need to hide, now." I didn't know what to do. Everything in me was telling me to call the police, but the fear in his eyes was real, and for a moment, I felt torn between helping him and protecting myself. He seemed desperate, looking around as if he were being followed. Finally, curiosity and empathy got the better of me, and I pointed to the back door. "You can wait back there," I said, trying to hide the nervousness in my voice. He quickly thanked me and headed to the back door, disappearing into the darkness of the storage room. As soon as he was gone, the silence in the store felt heavier than ever. I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. What if he was in trouble with dangerous people? What if I ended up involved in something much bigger than I could handle? The minutes that followed were tense. Every little sound seemed amplified, and I kept looking out the window, expecting something or someone to appear. But the night remained quiet, with the sporadic flow of cars remaining normal. I tried to get back to my work, but my mind was racing, imagining all sorts of scenarios. Then I heard the sirens in the distance. My heart sank when I saw the red and blue lights flashing outside. 2 police cars pulled into the station, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Before I could do anything, 2 officers entered the store, with serious expressions. "We're looking for a man who might have passed through here," one of them said, showing a photo. I recognized the man in the photo immediately. It was the customer I had hidden in the back. My stomach turned, and what seemed like a simple decision now weighed on me like an unbearable burden. I knew I had to tell the truth, but the words seemed stuck in my throat. Finally, I pointed to the back door, feeling the weight of my decision. The officers didn't waste any time. They quickly opened the door and disappeared into the storage room. The silence was replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps and firm orders. In a few minutes, they returned, bringing the man in handcuffs. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, and he avoided looking at me. The fear that had been in his eyes was now replaced by resignation. One of the officers approached me afterward, explaining that the man was wanted for a serious crime. They didn't give many details, just enough for me to know that my decision to let him hide had been dangerous. I was in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. That man, who seemed like just an ordinary customer, was actually someone on the run from the law. When the officers left, taking the man with them, the store returned to its usual silence. But for me, nothing felt normal anymore. The remaining hours of my shift dragged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What disturbed me most wasn't that he had been arrested, but the idea that I had been so close to something so dark without even realizing it. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about that night. The fear in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, it all haunted me. I never found out exactly what he had done, but the experience taught me a hard lesson about trusting strangers. From that moment on, I became much more cautious, always wondering about the untold stories of the people who walked into the station during the night. Eventually, I left the job at the gas station, unable to continue working there without being constantly reminded of that night. It was as if the store had become a place of disturbing memories, and every night shift was a journey back to the fear I had felt. Life went on, but the lesson stayed with me. We can't always see what's behind someone's eyes, and danger may be closer than we imagine. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out the Wrong Turn Horror Stories compilation by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.